We've heard that Mark Bertelsen sends emails to Joe early in the morning with promptings and things that he should be looking into. I wonder if we could, Mark, if we could ask you to give us a few words about the vision that you had in forming this church.
You know, Joe mentioned one thing in answer to your question earlier today is that he, in his graduate students, he wants them to prepare research papers, but he also wants them to prepare a PowerPoint that he can present to the PTA, and I think that's kind of part of getting at that. Well, you know, the vision of this really came from Chuck and Bruce Bimber, and I think that one of the great things about this is you know, you have Bruce Bimber, a political scientist, which is my undergraduate degree. Rod Alfernus was back there, I don't know if he's still there. The Dean of Engineering and his predecessor, Cynthia in Communications, Andrew Flanagan, who is a computer scientist. I mean, this is the essence of what we're talking about. I've spent my professional career dealing with entrepreneurs and technology, and you know, there's the laws of unintended consequences have come into play, so I think that, and you know, not to belabor the points that have already been made about you know, the good points and bad points of technology. I will add one other thing to the discourse, and I'm really not trying to make a political point here. You know, today, the 5 most valuable companies on the planet are technology companies, and they're all relatively young. Apple and Microsoft were started in the 70s, Amazon in the early 90s, Google in the late 90s, and Facebook in the 2000s. I mean, some of them are approaching $1 trillion in market value. You know, over 100 years ago, President Theodore Roosevelt was uncomfortable with this kind of thing. He actually wrote a paper on it called Control of Corporations. And I'm really not suggesting anything specific, but I do think, and I had to look up who said this, but I did remember the phrase, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's this English guy, Lord Acton, that said it. And when you get that kind of wealth and that kind of power, almost inherently associated with it are hubris and thinking you can influence things. Look, these are great companies for the most part, but there are limits, I think, to what you look for from companies like this, and so how we as a society deal with this is I think a very, very important question. And as to the final thing I'll say, and this sounds like bragging, and maybe it is, about what to do with your 10-year-old. We have a 14-year-old grandson, and they were living us for a while where their house was being remodeled. That's a social petri dish in itself. He and his 2 sisters. But we were having a conversation one night, and this sounds like we do this every night, which wasn't the case. But and somehow I thought, and I brought out this thing. Well, I said, he's Luke. I said, well, Luke, you know, the unexamined life isn't worth living. And I said, didn't Plato or somebody say that? And he said, no, Grandpa, Socrates said it. And I was just floored. And I said, Luke, where did you even learn that or know that? He says, well, my 8th grade social studies teacher. Man, if you can get an 8th grade social studies teacher that can get kids thinking about things like that, I mean, that's really a key, because he spends a lot of time on the phone, but you know, to have someone impart that to them, which is, you know, what you all do as professors to the students here. I mean, that stuff is, I mean, we were talking earlier about what some of my classmates and I learned outside of our disciplines. and I'll mention it again, his name was Professor Sturman, Dewey Sturman, and he taught this class called The Bible as Literature. And so it wasn't a religious class, it was the Bible as literature.
It was hard to get into.
And as Reese Duca pointed out, you know, the stories in particular in the Old Testament were stories that in order to understand the meaning of life or wisdom, you had to be vulnerable. And that Professor Sturman would say, live vulnerably. You know, that had nothing to do, I mean, going to law school and starting a legal career, but it's amazing how those things kind of come back to you over time and recycle in your brain. I've gone on here too much, and it's great to have Joe on board, and I really like what the new dean, Professor Hale, said about whatever those 3 things were. Those were great.